Minnesota ROKKR, ninth place this year. They had a shot at the end of the year to make it to champs. I want to get to it in a minute, but there's a reason why they're not at champs. 165 points on the season, 15 and 24 in matches, 39% win percentage, 72 and 93 in terms of maps, which is 44 map win percentage. Um, let's talk about it because it is kind of like the biggest reason that they're not at champs this season. Game 5 record. They were the team that I actually started with, and then I did it for everyone else. So, like, just to give you an idea of what the Game 5 records is, I said at the beginning, Vegas 2-3 on the year, LAG 2-7 on the year, not great. C9 3-6 on the year. Minnesota ROKKR 8-9, 17 Game 5s on this season. 17 of their 39 matches were Game 5s. They lose 9 of them. I should mention also they won 4 to start the season, so they were 4-0 in Game 5s at one point, and then they went 4-9 the rest of the way. I think they finished 35 points behind Boston for 8th place, so they basically needed 4 more wins. There's a lot. I'm sure they could look back at just the Game 5s that they had, the 9 losses that they had, and said, like, could we have gotten 4 just from that alone? And I'm sure they probably could. That just, to me, stuck out to have that many to go to Game 5. There probably were series that did not need to go to a 5th game, and they just weren't able to pull it out. They were at their best in Search and Destroy this year, but they weren't necessarily. There wasn't like one that was just a game mode that was so much worse than the rest. Their worst game mode was Hardpoint, but they were 40%, which is not as bad as you would imagine, considering them being in the bottom 4. But yeah, this is they have an interesting offseason because they had an interesting offseason last year. They resulted in Estriel, Geo, and Nero and Paul X coming into the team. We talked about so much at the beginning of the season. Did they have the leadership to make a run? It seemed like a lot of young guys that did not have like the vocal, I guess, veteran leadership that we usually expect of these rosters. I don't know if that really played out the way that we thought it would, but now that they brought Kenny in, that would seem to kind of resolve that. Where do you think Minnesota should or will go from here?
Yeah, I think Minnesota can go in a lot of directions. I think obviously after not making champs, they are going to make changes unless they just go on a, bonkers run at EWC. And I wouldn't put it past them just because like you mentioned they had that game 5 success early on in the season. Let's not forget like they were consistently reverse sweeping teams, and if they weren't reverse sweeping, they were going down 2-0 in series and forcing a game 5, and then they were losing that game 5. That plays a factor into how many game 5s they had, and I just remember mentioning early on, like you were talking about with the leadership and stuff, it definitely felt like that was lacking early on. But I remember saying like so many of their matches were going to game 5. This was going to be important for them as the season went on, just because they're getting maximum reps. They're getting the like, if they get in these situations at majors, like where they're down 2-0 in a series, they were the team that was consistently fighting back. And if it got to that point at champs where they were down 2-0, just for example, obviously they're not, but like they had the reps to be like, okay, we've been here before. We know we can pull off a reverse sweep. We just got to kick it into another gear and do what we did earlier in the season. They knew what they could do, and they had pulled off reverse sweeps. They had the game 5 wins, but it's just consistency really is the key word with this Minnesota team all year. They had, really that core 3 of Estriel, Geo, and Nero. They all had some really great performances individually, and it just felt like the 3 of them never clicked at the same time. It felt like, especially most recently at Major 4, and obviously early on in the season at numerous times, but at Major 4, from the matches I watched, I remember like Nero was absolutely popping off, and when somebody is just going nuclear to that level, it makes sense that the kill numbers are going to be a little, there's going to be a disparity there because, as we always say, there are only so many kills you can get on the map. But it just felt like to me, like even I feel like in major two qualifiers was when Estriel really kicked it into another gear for this team and really started to shine. But just as a whole, it felt like of that core three, there was never there just wasn't a ton of consistency from all three of them performing at a high level at the same time. It was always either one or two of them really playing well, and then somebody was lacking, or like one player of the three was doing well, the other two weren't playing as well, and that's when the losses were coming. So to me, that's like the indicator that Minnesota did a really good job identifying this talent. I think Estriel, Gio, and Nero are all really strong players individually, and I think all three will be in the CDL next year. I just think this has shown that it doesn't work together as this core, and maybe it's just they haven't had enough time since bringing in Kenny, and maybe they decide to run it back next year because you think from a contractual standpoint, like those three guys, at least Estriel, Gio, and Nero, probably signed their deals. Well, there is no more league minimum, but they probably weren't like super expensive contract wise, if I had to guess. Nero there was that thing early in the offseason last year where like Nero potentially was going to go to Cloud9, but then they decided to go with Mac, and that's when Nero went to Minnesota. So maybe Nero gets some options from other teams here and there. But for me, with this Minnesota squad, I if you watch the show this year, how much it pains me to say that I think they're going to break up because I saw the potential. I really like this squad. I just think from a consistency standpoint, it just wasn't able to work on a consistent basis. And I think Minnesota, end of the day, unless they just go on an absolutely bonkers run at EWC, I think they're going to blow it up. But I don't think, from Gentle Mates and Cloud9 perspective, I think just completely move on and start fresh. I think here with Minnesota, they pick either one of Estriel, Gio, or Nero. And I mean, they could even pick two, I guess, end of the day. But I think they have the foundational pieces there in either one or two of those guys, and then they build something different just because, they didn't get the champ, so they got to do something different. But I just don't know that if it was me right now, I really like Nero and Gio. I think I would build around Estriel. I think he showed the potential this year. To just be a really solid foundational piece. And it was really like last year there was that chatter at the end of the year in the rookie of the year race where it felt like it was like a runaway for Gwyn, and even if you didn't think it was a runaway, it was like Gwyn and Abuza. But there were those people in the community who were like, why is Estriel not getting mentioned enough here? And I think for those people this year was like kind of certification of that. Like he showed a lot of more potential this year, I feel like, and especially from a statistical standpoint. So I think I would build around Estriel this current squad, but I mean I could sit here for a while and talk about why I think you could build a solid squad around Estriel, why you could build a solid squad around Geo, why you could build a solid squad around Nero, or any combination of those two. So Minnesota definitely has some options in the offseason. But I do think, that I've been high on Minnesota throughout this year. Maybe I'm still on that copium right now for EWC, but if they go on a good run at EWC, maybe they decide to run the squad back in entirety. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's probably a mistake. It feels like um, just getting kind of caught up in the end of the result or the end result and thinking that it's gonna work out next season. Unless you're gonna be, unless you feel like you're like a Boston kind of situation where it's not really about competing for like a championship. It's more just about getting to champs, and that's kind of like the end goal. Because then you probably could run it back with these four and just kind of convince yourself that our team chemistry will kind of be the deciding factor with some of those other teams. Um, but yeah, I was trying to look it up while you're talking. I can't find it. I don't know what episode we talked about it, but it was at the beginning of the season or before the season. We talked about how one of these players needed to step up and become like a next level kind of player in order for Minnesota to have more success than just being kind of a middle of the road team. And that didn't happen. Like you can make it like you said, that each of them had these moments, right, where they looked like, oh, this is, they're kind of taking a leap, but neither or none of these four players, but specifically the three players that started and finished the season with Minnesota, none of them turned out to be the superstar that you typically need to win champs and to be like a true championship contender. And maybe they were never meant to be that, but that does make it really, really difficult when you go into an off season and you're like, you can talk yourself into any of these three players remaining on the roster into next season. Kenny is also an interesting case because I thought it was a risk to pick him up when they
Yeah.
did, because his stock had never been lower in his professional career. So he definitely had a better time with Minnesota than he did with Optic, which was an interesting development. That being said, I don't know if he's gonna be the guy next year, but if they were to build it, take this team and say we're gonna take Estriel and Kenny, and we're gonna try to get some really good talent in here next year that maybe fit around Estriel specifically, maybe that is the key to success for Minnesota. I just think it's a really difficult decision because, like you mentioned, like Estro Gio or Nero, any one of them could break out and be, the guy that you build around. But I don't
Yep.
know if there is. I also don't think if Minnesota. I don't know if Minnesota can actually get the big free agent, or if they have the G2 backing, so they have this very well organized organization, but at the same point, like, can they get the player that they're gonna need to win championships? That feels like probably not. Like, especially with Atlanta and LAT and Optic all kind of looming in the top three. So maybe the Toronto guys. I think, like, we'll see what happens with the Ultra. But I'm sure if they picked up Kleenex, you're all on board with Minnesota. I think if Insight the same way, like, um, who knows? Joe DeCeves has had a really, really good season this year. Could Minnesota be able to get Joe on their team and then build around him? I just think they have a lot of interesting ways to look at their offseason. I just don't know if they're going to actually have a successful offseason as a result of that.
I do think it is just to put a bow on it. Even though it was just like less than 5 minutes ago, I forget exactly how you just phrased it, but like the conversation around like championship contending or whatever with this Minnesota squad, that really, like, heading into this season, it was kind of like similar with Carolina. Like, I don't think either of us had
Yeah.
very high expectations for this team. At least as a team, I definitely remember saying like I was excited about some of the, really it was Gio and Nero
Mm-hmm.
at the start of the season for me, or before the season even started. And then Estriel played very well and started to grow on me very much as the season went on. But yeah, like heading into the season, that really wasn't like a thing. But just the fact that even for a team that didn't make it to champs, like it's like that this squad has the potential to maybe like get to a championship Sunday or something, and it just wasn't realized. Like that's an interesting tidbit in itself, and like maybe like that moves the benchmarks for exactly what this Minnesota team is trying to do in the offseason.
And just to kind of put a bow on it to make it official, so your keeper cut is keep Estriel, and we'll include Looney in this as well.
Yeah, like Looney. Like I said, I mean, I could sit here for a while and talk about really all three of the. I mean, you brought up an interesting point with like maybe it's one of the core three plus Kenny to keep and then cut the other two. I think Gio and Nero are going to get some offers from some other teams, and maybe they decide to go elsewhere. I mean, Estriel could too for all that. So I think right now, if I was the GM, I would be trying to find a way to keep two of the core three whichever two I thought were the best in terms of working together and whatnot. And then getting two guys to piece around them. But if I had to make something right now, I would want to keep Estriel and see what I can build around him.
Yeah, I'm probably keeping Estrio and Geo, and then trying to figure out the other two. But again, this
I
is
like it.
they have a good problem in that they
Yeah,
have
yeah.
good young players, but they can't run it back just as is unless they're just content with finishing, somewhere between 6 and 8, and maybe even not that, considering.
And this, yeah.
Yeah. So so they went 6-10 with Kenny in this lineup. So like that's, I don't know what that would turn out to be over a full season if they would be able to beat Boston, but it obviously didn't work out, and they'll have a long off season ahead of them.